is not the end of this conversation. We're just reviewing your soil test. I have gone over your intake forms and I will do my best to hit on the topics. But if you have those additional questions, just either pop them in the chat or let me look at the chat and make sure I don't have any. Great. Hi, everybody. Wonderful. Yeah, just pop them in the chat or hold them to the end, however you like. And so we're going to be talking about our soil test. And this is a standard soil test. We're using a Malic 3 extraction for this soil test. Not that that is supposed to mean anything to you, but it is an extraction solution that is formulated to be about a 2.5 or 2.6 pH. And so it's an assumptive tool for pulling as much of the nutrients that they feel microbes or plants could get access to out of our soil matrix. And then they go through and, do their calculations and say, okay, you have so many parts per million of this and so many parts per million of this. And so it is a snapshot in time. And, when I went around and took your soil test, I was taking cores from, different areas to make them a composite soil sample. And so, if we ever hit a hot spot of a particular element or something like that, that can be factored in. But in essence, a standard soil test is it's a quantitative tool that we can use to make recommendations for amending your soil. There are many caveats, and we'll go into some of those caveats with these soil tests. There are different types of soil tests, and we can talk about those as well, but this is the one that so many agronomists use to make fertility amendment recommendations. We're also, we're looking at the chemistry with our soil report, but the physical aspect of the soil, that texture, the sand, silt, clay, or the actual structure of our soil, the function of our soil, the soil report doesn't tell us that. And that's where, me being in your garden, taking a core of your soil periodically through the life of your soil, or you doing the same, you can see the soil structure. And then you can make a good estimate on how the soil is functioned. You can also see that in the health of your plants. And then there's the biological aspect of your soil. And so the biology, in my mind, there's I don't even remember where I heard it first, but, biology trumps chemistry. The biological aspect of your soil, and that's plants, that's the macro and microfauna and flora of your soils. They are the ones that are working together in that soil matrix, making nutrients available, solubilizing elements away from the parent material and organic matter. So it is a snapshot in time, but it is a tool that we can use to make some good estimates on what your soil might need. And I always err towards biologically friendly, and I err towards not trying to push anything into excesses. Excesses in many cases can be more more of a snag than deficiencies. You can always add more, but you can't take it away. And there are some elements that can be really detrimental if you add too much. And there are some that you just have to deal with and work around. And that's where foliar sprays and fertigation and biological amendments can assist. We'll see some of those going through our soil tests. We have 6 soil tests to go through. We have an hour and a half time allotted. I'll try to be really respectful of that time. I'm going to talk fast. I'm going to blow through some information. You can always connect with me after the fact. My goal is to get you some recommendations, and whether these are actually shared, over this Zoom, or I just email them to you later, you'll get them. Okay, is the spreadsheet that I created to do the analysis. And so it looks different than your soil report that you got from Logan, that, PDF that I forward to you. But it is, it's the same information. It's just, it looks different. And let me see if I want to make that a little bigger. And so we're going to go over this first one here, Kaylee, your hoop. what we're seeing is, first I just take a look and see what the pH is, and that lets me know that when a pH is high, 7 is neutral. And so when a pH is above 7, moving into the alkaline realm, it is letting me know, one, because we used a Malic 3 for this extraction, that we're going to be pulling more of these cations, these guys right here, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. We're going to be pulling more of those out, or more of those are going to be picked up in the analysis. And so I do a little calculation when I see a pH that's over 7.2 really, and kind of knock it back just a little bit. And so it says, that your cation exchange capacity, or your TCEC, your total exchange capacity, is should turn all those little comments off, is 26. But in reality, I think it's a little lower than that. I think it's, maybe around, 19 or 20, in that 19 to 22, which is still pretty good. We definitely want it above 10. If it was below 10, that's, going to be pretty low. That TCEC, and this is for everybody, so it'll be great to go over the same information multiple times, but your exchange capacity, and they're saying your cation exchange capacity. And so those are the positively charged elements in your soil. And so the primaries are calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, but iron, manganese, copper, zinc, those are all positively charged as well. And so that cation exchange capacity is in essence the negative exchange sites. And so it's a positive and a negative charge. They're positively and negatively charged particles. One is, a nutrient, an element, an ion. The other is more than likely a clay colloid. And so when we have clay as a part of our soil texture, which we do in our area, that clay is negatively charged, and it plays a big role in how our soils are able to hold on to nutrients. So the total exchange capacity is letting you know, in essence, how large your tank is for holding on to nutrients, how much space, how many exchange sites do you have to plug in positively charged elements. And there are preferential ways that is ordered in the soil. There's, the charge preference, different elements will have preference on the colloids, and they'll kind of stack out from there. Our negatively charged exchange, or our positively charged exchange sites in the soil tend to come more from the organic matter and the humic substances that are created by the microorganisms, the plant microorganism mutualism. Over time, humic substances are built up and the organic matter is built up in the soil. And that gives us a place for those negatively charged elements to be held. And so that's going to be your sulfur, it's going to be your phosphorus, that's going to be your boron, your molybdenum, your nitrate, compounds and elements like that. And so it's important to kind of get an idea of where you sit with an exchange capacity. It's not something that changes very easily. Building soil organic matter is not, that's something that just takes time. Putting mulch on the top of our soil is not what builds soil organic matter, not stable soil organic matter. Putting mulch on top of our soil does play a role in it, but it's only a role. So we have our exchange capacity that's letting us know how much room we have for those very important positively charged elements. Our pH is letting us know, in essence, each one of these elements has a charge, but it also has, are they alkaline or are they acidic? And so all of these guys, the calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, are alkaline. The potassium, the sulfur, not all negatively charged anions are the negative charged, are acidic, and not all cations are alkaline. but they tend to go that way. And so the amount of these elements in our soil is what builds up our pH, along with the organic matter, the parent material. Our parent material in our area is inherently alkaline. You know, we've got a silt clay loam, not a lot of sand. We have more of a limestone kind of dolomitic parent material that, you know, is alkaline in nature. And so when we have a pH that's above 2.4 or 7.2, we're picking up more of those alkaline elements in that solution, in that extraction. And so it kind of skews this test a little bit, but I do just a little tweaking on it to balance it out. And so here you've got, and this is in the amended area, right? This is the hoop. This is the area where you've been working most. This is the area where you've been adding more compost. And so we'll see that through the soil test, but that is certainly represented here in the soil organic matter. So when you take a soil core, you know, I'm trying to be conscious of that when I'm pulling that core to make sure that I'm not, you know, taking that really top horizon of the soil that's all that organic matter mulchy stuff. I try to knock that off and actually just take the soil, but your organic matter is going to be more concentrated in that first couple of inches of your soil, and we're doing a soil core that's 6 inches deep. And so, you know, that first couple of inches, especially if it's been composted a lot, is going to have is going to skew that organic matter reading, which is a great thing. You know, over time that breaks down, feeds the tiny little you know, macro arthropods, all the little mites and springtails and the, you know, potworms and all of those guys in your soil that are going to then you know, eat all that tiny little bits of organic matter, feed it then to the bacteria and the fungi. Bacteria and the fungi are the ones that are actually making that stable soil organic matter, the humus of our soil, which has staying power, which is what helps, you know, build our soil structure, which is, you know, long-term carbon storage. Okay, so here you've got a sulfur in this amended area, a sulfur reading of 44 parts per million. Sulfur is an anion. This is accurate. And that's great. You know, I would like to see at least 34 parts per million, and you've got plenty. So you're doing good there. Sulfur is really important for so many things. You know, many of the enzymes that we all need, living life needs these organisms in order to, you know, do several metabolic functions, but it also is really important for creating complete proteins and for carbon fixation in the soil. Those are just two very important ones. So phosphorus, you're high. You're not like way off the charts high, but you are high on phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of those elements that I try to caution against letting get too out of control or too high, because you will potentially run into issues with mycorrhizal fungi being able to build associations with your plants. We have, I'm sure, in the garden or across the email threads, you know, I'm sure mycorrhizal fungi have, you know, been chatted about, but mycorrhizal fungi are one of the plant associated, you know, they're a host obligate. You know, they have to have a host in order to be fed. They can't get carbon any other way, and they have to have the sugars, the carbon, in order to function. And so mycorrhizal fungi are a kind of a keystone species in the health of our soil. They have a whole consortium of organisms that support them in the functions that they perform. Mycorrhizal fungi are known to be able to supply every known essential nutrient to plants and water. And they also help bind together soil aggregates to make porosity, to make, you know, to help with that soil function. And so mycorrhizal fungi are very important for soil health and optimal nutrition of our soil, or optimal nutrition of our plants, the food that we're eating. And so we want to do everything we possibly can to make sure that mycorrhizal fungi are welcome and present in our soils. And so I do caution against getting too high with the phosphorus, and especially if it's water soluble phosphorus. And so a lot of the compost that we get access to will have had manures in them. And depending on what those animals consumed, or if bone meal or any of those types of inputs were in there, that's one way that phosphorus is going to come into the garden, is through composts. Also our mulch materials, if we're using a lot of, wood chips, or if we're, if we're applying phosphorus. There are so many different forms of phosphorus, or different amendments that contain phosphorus. Working with a rock-based phosphorus, like a soft rock phosphate or a Tennessee brown rock phosphate, those are great tools that do not inhibit mycorrhizal fungi colonization. Compost can have both soluble and non-soluble fixed phosphorus. And so I don't know if this is soluble or non-soluble. We would need to do a saturated paste test to figure out how much of that is soluble in your soil. And that's something that you could consider doing in the spring, doing a saturated paste test. And that would be, another data point. But I would be cautious about adding additional compost to this soil or inputs that included phosphorus. And you can check with me on that, and we can come up with some, some good blends or whatever. But utilizing inoculum, mycorrhizal fungi inoculum, on the seeds and the transplants that you put into the ground there would be advisable for many years to come, just in case you're having any issue with the native mycorrhizal fungi building relationships, building a mycelial net there. This is common in our area, that magnesium is a little high. Calcium and magnesium have a dynamic role. They kind of have this interplay, and you want to have a calcium to magnesium ratio that's in our soils. It would be great to have, 7-to-1. We have really dense soils in this area. So having a higher calcium amount and a lower magnesium amount is a good way to go. Just because we have high magnesium on our soil report does not mean that we have plants that are able to access that magnesium. And so we need to look out for magnesium deficiencies visually on our plants, and I can assist with that during the season. But I would not add any inputs that have magnesium. Magnesium makes our soils tight. It's a small ionic radius. Its ion has a small ionic radius. It's kind of like a golf ball, where calcium is a beach ball, and they both have double positive charges. And so they're pulling together clay particles. And so would you rather, clay particles get pulled together. You've got either a beach ball calcium holding them together, which is expanding your clays. It's flocculating your clays, flocculating your soil, expanding them out, or a golf ball that holds them really close together and tightens your soils. And so that's where we want to watch that magnesium. And so don't add any dolomite, don't add any Solpol mag, or even Epsom salts to your soil. You could do an Epsom salt spray, a foliar spray if your plants were showing signs of magnesium deficiency. That would be a good fix, but avoid magnesium in general. Potassium, high, a little high. It's okay for it to be high. Where we took this, we were end of season. You having potassium, high in the soil in the early part of the season in the spring can actually inhibit calcium uptake with our plants. Our plants are in the spring really needing a strong calcium flow, constant 24-hour calcium flow. And if we have too much potassium being made available in the soil solution, and they're taking that up, they can't help but take it up. There's not a way for them to prevent from taking it up. And so I wouldn't apply any more potassium to your soil. And so when I look at a soil and I see high phosphorus, high potassium, potentially high sodium, high zinc, that tells me that's your compost. And usually I see that with soils that have had a lot of compost over time, and usually a manure-based compost. And so if that's the case, I would pause that for this area. We'll see the other test and we'll see something else. But for this area, pause the compost. We'll work on something else for your mulch material. And now you've got plenty of nutrient in the soil. And so working to make this available to a plant and then also help deal with the excesses. That's where your mycorrhizal fungi will come into play. So this is where we can see the ratios. And so ideally, with our structure or our soil texture, having a, 68, could be 70% calcium would be ideal. Around 10% magnesium, great. 4% potassium, awesome. 1% sodium, great. Having a little bit of room in there for the other bases, that's also a great thing. Hydrogen also is not it's not a nutrient, but it is a positively charged ion that kind of holds space. A plant uses hydrogen, whether it's hydroxide or actual hydrogen, they excrete that to be able to exchange. That's the exchange. They excrete hydrogen from doing their photosynthesis. They break the water molecule. They have extra hydrogen. They release the oxygen. They take that energy from that molecule and do their photosynthesis, but they are able to take that hydrogen and then exchange it. They're able to excrete that out their root system, which is acidic. Hydrogen is acidic. So they're able to excrete it out of the root system and get nutrients off of the clay colloid. And so we want to have room for hydrogen to have a role to play. But when our soils have a pH that's high, we don't really have that option. Some people use sulfur, like elemental sulfur, to bring their pH down. I feel that's harsh, and you don't need any more sulfur, so you don't need to worry about that. I wouldn't do it. What I would do is now just work on biological activity, and the biology will trump the chemistry, and it'll fix the pH over time. I want to see at least 1 part per million of the boron, and you're doing good. You're almost right up there. Boron is really critical to get calcium into a plant, and so it plays a big role with that calcium silica cell wall structure. Really important. Manganese, this is not necessarily the manganese and the copper with the Malic 3 is not necessarily super accurate reading, and so I don't recommend applying these to the soil, especially when we have a high pH or oxidized soil, which are usually synonymous. So I would not worry about these guys. I'll recommend the foliar that will have these in the right form for the plant to take them up and utilize them. Same with the zinc. You can apply zinc to the soil. It's something that is easily taken up by a plant if applied to the soil, but you don't need any. You're topped off. You do want to watch this copper zinc ratio. And so what I think is going to happen when the biology really gets clicking in that in this area, then this copper number is probably going to come up, but we'll see that in another soil test in another 2 years or so. But in the meantime, being mindful that your copper is low. And so utilizing a foliar that has copper in it, just trace amounts will help, almost homeopathic amounts, tiny little bits. Molybdenum, this is really important. Cobalt and molybdenum are really important for the nitrogen fixing organisms. And so having a well-formulated foliar application, whether you use it as a fertigation or whether you use it as a foliar, it's up to you. But I will say that using a well-formulated foliar as a foliar is going to be so much more efficient, economical and time efficient. And so utilizing a pump sprayer and applying that to your plants directly onto the leaf surface. And I'll go through all the ins and outs of how to do that. This is basically just a calculation letting you know with the amount of organic matter that you have, this is what is assumed would be released in pounds per acre, in essence, by the microbes. Okay, so that is that one. So we talked a lot. I'm going to just move on to the next one. But if anybody has any burning questions, I'll check the chat right now and just make sure there's nothing in here that I need to look at. No, if you have any burning questions, you certainly can raise your hand if that's an option. If not, just unmute yourself and holler, and we'll stop and take a look. Okay, so this is that expansion area. And so still looking pretty good on the exchange capacity. And so I think that the exchange capacity here, this is really more native soil, right? And so unamended soil. And so that's good, that's really good. 6.5, awesome. Ideal pH is going to be between 6.4 and 7 or 7.2, but most of your nutrients are available in that range. And yeah, you just have a lot more room to play if your pH is in that range. Organic matter, obviously you can kind of see that it's a little bit lower, but you haven't been amending this area with compost for a couple of years. And so it's good, above 4 in this area is really good. We're looking at residential spaces, we're looking at gardens. And so it's not unusual to see really high organic matters. But if we were looking at the fields in the area, that's where we're going to see organic matters that are 3 and 4 native. So you see here, our sulfur is low here. And so that's something to consider when making an amendment recommendation for this area. We certainly want to make sure that that sulfur is moving up a little bit. And so we'll get some, whether that's with a gypsum or let's see, sorry if this makes your head spin. Yeah, we're going to just do a little bit of gypsum. This is a small area, 300 square feet. And so these are going to be tiny amounts of stuff. And it's something, again, I try to err towards, not too much at once, and, feeding in meal size amounts. And so we could do a little elemental sulfur this fall, and then some gypsum in the spring. And I think your soils will be happy to have that. The phosphorus is, so when I see a phosphorus number of at least 75, I think you're good. You can go higher. And so you could do some compost in this new area. But just be mindful, and it's good to look at the analysis of the compost. And so whoever you're getting your compost from, if they have an analysis, it would be great to see that. So how much of these, sulfur, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, sodium, you're adding to your soil, and then you can kind of gauge how much of that compost you should be adding. But because this is native, in essence, it's not native, it is unamended soil, you have a little bit of playing room there. So you could do, a couple really solid applications, I think, and not tilt yourself too far. Pardon me, I'm gonna take a sip of tea. Okay. Calcium, you could do some calcium, and that's where that gypsum is going to come into play. That'll be a spring application and not for fall. But we could also do something like a carbonatite, which is a it's an igneous rock, rock dust. It has a plethora of elements represented in there. I can't remember the number, 68 or whatever. But it has high calcium and phosphorus analysis, relatively high for a rock dust, and it's more active. It's most of the, like a rock phosphate, whether it's a Tennessee brown rock or a soft rock, they are less of, phosphorus is typically not very available in a rock form. This just happens to be just slightly more available or more accessible for the microbes. And so it's got some really great attributes to it. And so adding a little bit of that in the fall would be okay, because it needs to be worked on over time. But the gypsum is a input that will be less valuable applied in the fall, because it's going to become soluble rather quickly, and you'll lose that calcium and that sulfate to the winter thaw and you won't get access to it very well for your crops for spring. And so we would wait and add that later. Looks like you're doing good. I'm glad you're not way too high on the magnesium here. You've got that 68% calcium, 14% magnesium, a little bit lower on the magnesium would be good, but that's great where you're at. Good on the potassium. Potassium, I like to just hold off. Don't apply potassium, or like nitrate. Don't apply nitrogen in the fall. Don't apply potassium in the fall unless you're like way deficient, and you're actually growing through the winter, which we aren't. The only thing I would really consider applying in the fall now are inputs that need to be worked on by the microbiology over the winter, or inputs that are biological stimulants that are going to help activate and increase biology in our soil. So we'll do that too, but we want to hold off on anything that could be solubilized over the winter and be lost into our streams, but then also it won't be available to your plant. You'll have just all that'll go down a drain. And the potassium, again, like I mentioned, we want to make sure that we don't have that too high in the early spring. And so I wouldn't apply potassium until kind of when your plants are tipping into about to go into that phase change, transition into reproductive growth, considering adding that or activating the biology to make more of your potassium that you do have available, doing a biological boost. You can also add a potassium, it takes about 45 days if you're adding like a granulated potassium sulfate to your soil. It will take time for that to be fully available to your plant. So you can apply something like that, but I would caution, let's just see how your plants are responding and go biological. If we need to add a foliar of potassium, that's easily done. And a soil application side dress is also easily done with a plant available. Potassium, your sodium level, it could be a little higher, right? So you're less than the 1.5, you're less than 1. We could talk about that. If you end up adding compost, some of what I'm saying right now is going to be irrelevant. You're still going to need the calcium and the sulfur, but you're going to get, you're going to get the potassium, you're going to get the sodium, you're going to get the zinc, you're going to get the phosphorus, more than likely. Need a little boron here. And that is something that we would consider adding in late winter, early spring. And we could talk about that then. It's not much. It's going to be just like micro amounts. Again, the manganese and the copper, not really concerned about this reading right here. Well, you are low. It is more than likely pretty low, but applying manganese sulfate or copper sulfate to the soil is not necessarily what I think needs to be done. It's utilizing your well-formulated foliars. I'll make recommendations for those. And then, getting the biology active and working on soil structure. Overall, soil structure is, I think, the pinnacle of nutrient cycling, catalyst, in order to get nutrients to cycle out of your parent material, out of your organic matter, out of your amendments. Having soil that is well structured, where you have all of these micro habitats where all the microorganisms can do their specialized work. You need low oxygen environments, higher oxygen environments, super saturated environments, really dry. You need all of the things. And so having a well-structured soil that can accommodate all that, it's really important. Definitely gonna need a little bit of this cobalt and molybdenum. That'll be in a foliar blend. Looking all right on your silica. Yeah, so we're good there. And so, Kaylee, I do believe you were, root crops. That was something that you were concerned about. Soil structure is, if you don't have friable soil that is well structured, that is lofty, that it's hard to get here, especially, if the soil has been either compacted mechanically, or, we, all of us live in homes here, more than likely, many of us live in homes here that have been here for quite some time. And so our soils haven't been compacted in a long time, unless we're driving over them or doing something like that. But because we have that high silt content in our soil, and the magnesium tends to be a little high in our soil, in every rain event, and especially if our soil is ever bare, it oxidizes down that soil structure. Those glues and gums that hold the soil particles together can get oxidized, broken apart, and then we have the sand, those little particles that will end up getting brought down into the pore spaces of our soil. They'll just start plugging up all the, earthworm canals and all the little pore spaces. And so it's structure mostly, I think, having good root development. And so making sure that you have more, more access to the phosphorus, more access to the boron, more access to the calcium, to the potassium, making sure that your biology is really humming along is going to help with that. But for now, I would stick with root vegetables that are a little more tolerant of soils that aren't, easily penetrated, and doing that broad forking like we spoke about. That will help. And then the blueberry, asparagus, adding some additional perennials to the space. In the hoop area, of course, you don't probably want to do any perennials in there if you're going to do primary food production in there, because they'll take up permanent space. And because which I have perennials in my greenhouse, and so if you do want to do that, by all means, but tend towards perennials that can tolerate high pH, more alkaline soil. It wouldn't be, it would just be silly to try to drop that pH to make it accommodate blueberries. Blueberries need to have access to iron and molybdenum, and that's not really possible in an alkaline soil. And so in the newer area, in the unamended soil, you have more opportunity for that. And those asparagus, blueberries, all of those could be planted in the spring. Maybe the blueberries would do well here in the fall, but I think, getting good root development, before the winter is going to be critical for anything. And so I would wait until spring so that you can baby them a little bit more and really help them get those root systems developed if the soil is condensed. But also sticking with some plants that can tolerate higher pHs would be great. But again, the 6.5 is going to be a good zone. Like if the biology is really clicking along, that's going to work out okay. All right. And Steph, is this you or Sue? I'll just speak to both of you. So we have the exchange capacity 14.7. That's good. Especially knowing I don't know the history of the land that you're growing on, but I can assume the history, right? And so in Iowa, so much, if you look back at the aerial photos of our landscape from the 30s all the way through till now, so much of the land that's not immediately within the city, immediately within the town of Fairfield, we have, had agriculture, immense, long-term, decades, sometimes a century long agriculture. And so that can be a really extractive process. And if there has been any haying, or if there has been any haying, overgrazing, or row cropping, extractive. And so I wouldn't expect a piece of what could have been agricultural land to really, well, I won't say what I would expect, it can be anything. It's like, how was it managed? And you've got that forest around. And so it likely was, I guess I'll have to get that story complete, so I can understand a little more. But where you're sitting is good, 14.6 or 14.7, that's pretty good exchange capacity. I need to look at the soil texture there just to see, how much sand silt clay you have, but I feel like you might have a little more sand. Your soil and your subsoil is a little lighter color than you know, a little north from here. And so, yeah, it would be interesting to see what the parent material of your soil is. But 14.7 is good. That will grow over time as you're, diversifying your garden and just keeping it planted. One of the main things we have to keep in mind in order to build happy, healthy soil, feed microbes, is to have photosynthetic plants in our gardens on our land as much as possible. And so, I am not, I don't see weeds as an enemy. Weeds are just plants that are there doing their specialized work. Some of them are invasive and they need to be really watched. And of course, never let your weeds go to seed. But what they are doing is constantly feeding microbes if they're in their early part of their growth cycle. And so any plant that's going into its reproductive phase, especially annuals, tend to stop feeding the soil so much, and they start putting a lot of their sugar energy towards their seed. And so anytime you see even if it's our lawn, anytime you see a plant that's starting to go into its reproductive phase and it's not a crop plant that you want to harvest fruit from or seed, chop and drop it, mow it. And that way you can revive it or reset it to start making more sugars and feeding the soil more. So you can do that with your weeds as well. Plants that you want to live a long time, and well, any plant, if you chop it more than 50% of its above ground biomass, it'll slough off its roots. And that can be a good thing at certain times. But in general, you want a plant that's young and is at least 50% of its biomass is still available to photosynthesize. Those leaves, that plant material is, if it's green, is photosynthetic. And so those are the solar panels. So your organic matter, 4.6, that's our 4.4. That's good. That's, it's good baseline. You are going to have a hard time for a while holding on to things like sulfur, which I'm actually quite surprised that your sulfur level is at 28 parts per million. That's really good with a 4.4. And so I don't know if this is your, you've been working this space for a little bit. And so you've done well to build your sulfur there. That's good. Your phosphorus is, could be a little higher. Again, you've got room here, right? So you've got a pH that's in the ideal range. You have an exchange capacity that probably can hold a little more. This is, your organic matter is kind of letting you know what the negatively charged elements are going to be able to hold on to, and that's going to be your sulfur, your phosphorus, your boron, your molybdenum. Phosphorus really is not that. That's not true. Phosphorus binds. It locks up with calcium. It locks up. It's a triple negative ion. It's got a strong negative charge. So it binds to calcium if you've got an alkaline pH, or magnesium, or if you have an acidic pH, it's going to bind to aluminum or iron. And it's a really hard bond to break. And so it takes specialty microorganisms to do that. And mycorrhizal fungi and their associated consortia of microbes do that. And so that's where that's going to be important. Calcium, looking good. So maybe you've added some gypsum. I don't know, but looks good. I'm glad that your magnesium, again, is not way too high. It is just a little high. Your potassium, it says you have some room here to add some potassium. That's fine. Let's talk about that. You're probably, if you're adding more compost, it's going to come up. You're going to get that there. Sodium. That's interesting. So I need to have a one-on-one with you just to see what the amendments have been. But all of this is good, but I'm curious. That's good. Your sodium's fine. Your boron, you're going to need some boron. Talk about that for spring. Pretty good on the manganese. Again, this is not super accurate, but yeah, pretty good. Phosphor, or the copper and the zinc, that ratio you kind of want 2-to-1 zinc to copper. So you've in essence got that. I wouldn't worry about amending this. That foliar spray that I gave you earlier in the season, that has both of those in there in that small amount. And so your plants are going to have access to that. Same with the cobalt and molybdenum. And this is like most of the soils that I see here in our area are going to have low selenium, low molybdenum, and low cobalt, unless they're specifically adding those. Okay. And now let's see here. Brian. Oh, wait. Steph. So, oh, I remember you were saying, you were wanting to know more about, yeah, irrigation. Oh yeah, a few more perennials. Oh, that was, I'm sorry, Steph. I thought that was Kaylee. Okay, great. And so irrigation supplies we'll talk about. Cover crop we'll talk about. I think offline we'll talk about the irrigation, how to get that set up. And I will, be connecting with everyone about cover crop. It's now is the time. And so, yeah, I want to connect with everybody about that. Okay. So Ryan, it's our time. Okay. We've got, in essence, a little over 30 minutes left. Okay. So good exchange capacity. I like to, I got this, I think, from Dan Kittredge from the Bionutrient Food Association. I think that's the first place I heard it, and I don't know where he got it from, if he made it up or not, but your exchange capacity, whether if it's a total exchange capacity, it includes the hydrogen. If it's just the cation exchange capacity, it's just the calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. But it's your tank. It's like your fuel tank. And so it's how much fuel can you hold for, later use. And so having an exchange capacity that's definitely above 10 in our area, we want to see it, above 14 or 15. pH is way high. And so, this is actually not super accurate. I would say you may be in that like 17, 16 exchange capacity, but that's still good. Room to work on that. Being that your pH is high, you're going to have, access issues to some of your nutrients. A lot of your nutrients really drop off above 7. It's hard for plants to get access to it themselves. And so that's where biology comes into play, and those mycorrhizal fungi relationships. And yeah, and even you're going to have better luck with with plants that associate usually probably with actinobacteria. But I remember you saying that you might have some issue with some chard. And so we should do some like in-field assessment of your chard while it's still, actively going on. And I'm happy to come over. We'll schedule, if anybody wants to schedule garden check-ins, I sent everyone a link. And so please, feel free to do that. Yeah. Okay. Organic matter, good. You are a composting savant over there. You're just going for it. And so I get that. Lots of lots of mulching, really into it. So good. I don't know that everybody has heard this from me, but don't mix your mulchy, composty organic matter into the soil. Like if your compost doesn't look like soil, don't mix it into the soil. If it's not mature compost, don't mix it into the soil. Always have it as a barrier mulch protection layer. And if I were gonna, if I were going to apply compost and mulch, if they were two different things, then I would put my compost below the mulch right on the soil surface, and then the mulch on top of the compost to protect the compost. Your sulfur, sulfur, we need to work on that. This might be a good place to do some elemental sulfur. We can try to bring your pH down just a smidge, but again, the biology is going to correct that over time. But a little sulfur addition this fall would be good. And then pretty good on calcium. You're good on that. good on that. So yeah, looks like elemental sulfur in small doses over time. And then phosphorus is good. You're not doing a manure-based compost so much, and so I feel like you know what you're doing is good, but that you know the organic matter that you're utilizing, leaves, fall leaves are can be very alkaline, and so trying to orient your compost a little more acidic. And so maybe running some of the elemental sulfur through your compost pile. Elemental sulfur can be hard on fungi, is one reason why I'm hesitant to utilize it. It can be harsh, can be hot in, you know, in a localized way, but you can utilize organic matter inputs that are more acidic. And so that would take a little research, but I know like pine needles, you know, taking and chipping up, you know, pine branches, if you have access to those, things like that. If you see any of that at the municipal lot, kind of zero in on it for working on trying to get a little more of an acidic compost. And then there are also some biological amendments, some biological activators for compost. I like to use effective microorganisms a lot. And I think that this garden would be a good, especially since you're so into composting, you know, maybe get with me and I'll get you a little compost booster that could help deal a little bit with the pH and help make nutrients more available and help, you know, move your compost a little more acidic. And then, yeah, sodium, again, you know, that will, it's not necessarily considered a plant-based nutrient or a plant essential nutrient. Everybody just needs a little bit. It's nice to keep it in balance. Where are you with that? You know, adding a little Redmond's into a blend, Redmond's sea salt, or like a C90, or doing Korean natural farming prep with the, you know, fermented seawater. There's some different ways to get just small doses onto the land. You spray it onto the land, small doses. You definitely don't want to tilt your sodium too high, because that's going to kind of give you issues with other cations, but potassium, first of all. Okay, and your ratios, good. This, you know, a little higher than what we'd like to see it. Getting more of that sulfur into the into this growing system will help move some of that magnesium a little bit lower into the profile. Sulfur, all anions besides phosphorus, are in essence going to percolate down through the soil profile. They're going to leach. If your soil has the ability to percolate water, it'll percolate down through the soil profile. If your soil is really compacted and it sheets water, then that's where the anions will go. And that's going to be your boron, your molybdenum, your nitrate, your sulfate. Elemental sulfur has to be worked on over time by microbes in order to be made into a sulfate, which is the form that plants take up. And so it takes about 6 months for it to become available to your plants. And so working with that this fall would be a good idea. You're looking okay on your boron, but I think we'll probably suggest doing a little bit of a boron application late winter. It really does do a lot to help kind of boost that season. Boron is one of those inputs that we want to be very careful with. Like sodium, it can be an herbicide. You know, too much can be toxic, and applied in the wrong way at the wrong time can be toxic. And so utilizing a buffer, you know, a high carbon buffer, usually like a humic acid. Boron is rather alkaline. And so you want to have an alkaline carbon to buffer it. So humic acid, soluble humic acid works well. And you can make your own humic substances out of your worm, your vermicompost, or your compost. If you're making, you know, high quality compost, you can do a cold water extraction and pull some of the humics out of there, whether it's fulvic or humic acid. Looking pretty good on the manganese. Copper, you know, low a little bit. You know, copper is one of, it definitely plays, you know, an important role in plants, and it's really important for plant flexibility. If you're seeing plants that are really brittle, if you walk by your broccoli and you just barely brush its leaf and it just falls off, breaks. Same with fruit trees. If you're having a lot of snapping when the fruits, if things don't give, that can be a indication that copper is just not becoming available to your plants and they're able to utilize it. I would still move to using a foliar, applying it to the leaf surface. Plants, all the dicots, or most of the plants that we grow in our garden have they have these little, in essence, kind of breathing or, mouths on the bottoms of their leaves. Corn and, C4 grasses and monocots, they have on both sides of the leaves, but you can do foliar sprays. And so you want to orient your foliar sprays to the underside of leaves, go for it and go all over, because plant has its whole unique microbiome, just like we do. There's not a micrometer on myself, inside or out, that's not completely inundated with a whole community of microorganisms specialized to that particular environment, and so the same for a plant, inside, outside, in the roots, around, a halo around the plants, and all of those microbes have their own specialty roles, and a lot of those are going to help make nutrients available to plants. And so spraying the entire plant, but making sure the underside of the leaf is sprayed for most of our garden variety plants. Looking good on silica. Silica is one of those elements, it's, I think, the third highest element on the Earth's crust. We'll never be deficient. We'll never not have enough of it in our soil, but it's really, it's microbe mediated access, which so many things are, but really kind of difficult. It's still a mystery on who's actually solubilizing the silica and making it available in the right form for plants. But silica is critical for, structural strength and, whether it be, the phloem and the xylem being able to have, strong, streamlined tube structures for the nutrients and water to flow in and out of the plant. Same cell wall structure plays a huge role there. Calcium, boron, and silica are really important for building strong plants that are able to resist insect and disease pressure. And I would love to, come and do, like I said, Brian, a little cameo of your garden. I'd love to get a cameo of your water catchment too. I think everybody would really appreciate seeing that. We have a lot of people that are interested in water catchment, and so it would be interesting to get everybody's, anybody that's got a system that's up and running to be able to share that with others. So if you're open to that, that would be great. I'll connect with you later on it. Brassicas and cabbage. They are, brassicas, or not brassicas, Brussels sprouts. They're a really long season, and they are kind of like that second round of starts that you'll get going in the spring, really late spring or early summer. You would start those seeds indoors in a cool place, get them germinated with a little bit of heat, and then keep them, cooler, and then, give them that 6 weeks in a protected kind of climate controlled space, so that then they can go out into the garden in the late summer. That is more ideal for Brussels sprouts, I think. Cabbage, usually if you start them really early in the spring, get them in the garden in, just right at last frost. You'll have at least one round then, and we were late getting everybody's starts. We were just doing the best we could to get the starts out to everybody. The program didn't start when we wanted it to, and so we were just doing the best we could. And so probably that had something to do with some of the some of the stress on those plants, and because they were just going out a little too late. Not that they were not in great condition, but it just wasn't environmentally their optimal time. And so starting your cabbage seeds in in August, maybe early August, and then getting those plants out late August. They can go out much sooner than what you would buy a transplant in the in the store. And so, 4 weeks or so, if you've got a strong seedling, consider hardening it off and getting it out into the garden. But usually can get 2 rounds of cabbage. Certainly if you've got cabbage going right now, it would have been something good to get into the cold frame if your cold frame is in the soil, if you're actually planting in the soil, because they can handle quite a bit of, frosts if they're protected. And so it just depends, but just starting early for those guys in the spring, I think is really good. Ingrid. Okay. So we have really high exchange capacity. And I know that these beds have been amended with compost, pretty consistently over time. And I am assuming that's where that's kind of coming from. But yeah. And so 7 pH still pretty good in the range there. High, organic matter, that's kind of a artifact of the compost applications over time. I think that everything we're about to see is going to be artifacts of the composting consistently every season over time. This is really high. And so because your exchange capacity, all of these numbers for the ideals are going to be based off of your exchange capacity. And so because you have such a high exchange capacity, you have a lot more room to hold on to things, but still this is high for what you've got here. And so I would suggest backing off of compost. I think your beds they're fertile. And so now it's working with cover crops and biological activation and mulches for keeping your plants healthy. And then foliar spraying, you're probably going to have some issues with your plants getting access to some of these nutrients. And so that's where doing some of the foliar spraying will help. And then over time, as the biology is, really humming along, and healthy soil, like biologically active soil, that is not a consistent thing, right? And so it will ebb and flow with your management. It'll ebb and flow with the abiotic stresses of the world. And so you are, you are, you're constantly going to see that back and forth of biological activity. If your soils are allowed to dry out completely, you'll see a depression of your biological activity. If your soils are exposed to UV sun, the sun, you're going to see a depression of biological activity. You're going to see a shift. Every, oversaturation, if your soils, if we have a really wet spring and the soils are underwater for a couple of days, you're going to see a depression in biological activity, and you'll see a shift in that community. And so it takes a while for those, extreme events like that for the soil biology diversity to recover. And so utilizing cover crops, we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but utilizing cover crops that are ideally, grown in a diverse mix. And I would suggest probably, utilizing organic seed. But organic does not mean that they didn't use, soluble synthetic fertility inputs. And so when you're using soluble synthetic fertility inputs to grow a crop, you have a crop that is dependent on soluble synthetic, or not necessarily synthetic, but soluble, easily accessible nutrients. And when that is the case, they don't have a cause to build relationships with microbes. And then plants that are grown that way don't have a relationship in their, in the soil, in their rhizosphere, in order to build a really complex microbiome. And if you don't have a complex microbiome, you can't pass one on to your seed. And that's where most of the complexity of a soil microbiome comes from, is from seed. Each seed has its own core microbiome, and each plant family has, its own suite of microbes that it builds relationships with. And so having a cover crop mix that represents at least 4, if not more, plant families is a good way to help build biological diversity in your soil. And I would recommend that for everyone. But Ingrid, I would recommend that in the garden here to start maximizing the nutrient cycling of what you've got here. You've got a lot. You've got a lot. And so, you know, getting this plant accessible, getting it into biological form. And so getting the microbes, the broad suite of microbes that can utilize these nutrients, get them into their own biomass, into their own cytoplasm, into themselves. And then from there, they become, you know, they're metabolically ideal for a plant to consume. And there are many ways that a plant does that. And so that's what I would suggest here, is to get a diversified cover crop with an inoculum on it initially going in, and then utilizing your foliar applications. Treat your cover crops like a crop. Treat them, you know, like you love them, because they are, like I said, you know, that's where you have a broad suite of plants all together in a short or a small area with gardens. And if you can get them happy and healthy before winter, you know, before they go into their either senescing, you know, winter die-off, or they go into dormancy, then they've pumped a whole bunch of sugar down into the rhizosphere, and that's going to build structure. That's going to attract all of the microbes, all of the insects, all of the decomposers that want to be in there building soil. And so that builds soil, getting photosynthesis products into the soil. Good on boron, good on manganese. Interesting that this is low. So I'll chat with you offline about what the compost source was over time, but I don't think it's not critical to know that. Definitely want to be making sure that you're utilizing a foliar product that has copper in it. You do have that now, but continuing with a product that has copper in it, small amounts, doing okay. You're going to need this, but at least you've got a little bit. All right. And let's see here. Got some chats. Okay, cool. All right. So I am now just going to chat a little bit about cover crops. We are at the end of our season, which is, end of our growing season. We're about to hit the fall equinox, and now is the time to get cover crops into our soil. And so I'll send a questionnaire to everyone and see what their goals are around cover crops. Are you looking for something that is, that is a winter kill? Are you looking for something that does put down a lot, and we're not going to get a lot of biomass growth between now and first frost, but we'll get some. I think we'll still have to be prepared with some mulch to top dress our gardens once we have that first frost. We'll just see. If you are interested in doing cover crops, are you interested, like I said, either annual or perennial, winter kill or not, something that has a perennial component to it that is consistently going to be growing in that garden space that you then would do chop and drop mulch with, which I love. And then, I assume many of us are going to be doing broadcast. And so we want to start with some small seeds, or are we going to be doing do you have a seeder, or are you open to doing some seeding along with broadcasting? All of these seeds are going to need soil contact, but the smaller the seed, the less engagement that is. It could just be raking the seed in after you broadcast it. But if it's something a little bit larger, there would need to be a planting planned. And when it comes down to amendments, what I'll do, because we are, closing in on our time, I'd like to just send everybody recommendations in an email that's a little more, direct to your particular soil test. And that way you don't have to write all this down. And then I'll also, inquire about those cover crop preferences. And then we can make a plan for that. And so now if you have any additional questions beyond what was on your intake form, or if I didn't cover anything that was on your intake form, please go ahead and ask those, and I will gladly try to answer them if I can. If not, I'll try to get you pointed in the right direction. And I'll stop sharing. Okay, winter kill is just when, when a plant, typically an annual, but any plant that's not cold hardy enough to live through our winters. And so depending on, where you live, that's going to be different. Like, we can have annuals that will live past our winter that are winter hardy, that are cold hardy, but a lot of the cover crops that I might recommend will winter kill. And so that means they will just be taken out by the frost. Their above ground plant material will just lay down on the ground, and that'll act as a little bit of mulch over your soil, protecting your soil. We want to protect our soil all the time. Ideally, it would be a living green canopy over our soil, photosynthesizing, sending sugars to the soil microbes. But if we don't have that going on and we can see our soil, utilizing the mulch, making sure that we're covering our soil with some sort of biomass in order to keep it cool, keep it from oxidizing, and yeah, just protect it in general. Any other questions? You're welcome. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Is it good to interplant perennial cover crops with those that die off? Yeah. Diversity is really a great thing to just wrap your mind around and see about how many plant families you can get in there, cool season and warm season, or, perennial and annual, whatever you can get going on. Annuals are a plant that is more oriented towards sending those sugars down into their root zone rapidly, larger quantities in the early part of their life, because they have a short life and they need to build those relationships really early before they go into reproductive phase. So they send down more sugars in the early part of their life. So for us right now, having any fast growing, aggressive annual veg or annual cover crop in our gardens right now, just maximizing these, shorter days, these shorter sunlight hours, trying to get as much sugar down in there would be awesome. And then also having a long-lived perennial persistent plant that is constantly going to be there. It may be slower at sending the sugars down into the root zone. It may may have longer dormancy period. It may go into dormancy in the winter and not come out of dormancy until late spring. Something like alfalfa, or, clover comes up pretty early. It's, white clover tends to leaf out pretty early. But those mycorrhizal fungi that I was telling you about, they are, again, obligate symbiotes. And so they have to have a host all the time to feed them. And the ones that we're looking to support are called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and they don't associate necessarily a lot with our perennial, like our trees in the area. Some of them, there are some trees that do host those fungi, but mostly in our gardens, if we only have annual vegetables and annual cover crops in there, then over that winter period, and our winters can be rather long, that no leaf material feeding those mycorrhizal fungi, they can be impacted that in a negative way, and they can either die or reduce their biomass, their mycelial net, and they would have to rebuild. And it's better to have a perennial in place, several types of perennials in place, constantly feeding those mycorrhizal fungi over the winter. The perennials will send sugars down into the crown to make sure that they have enough energy in the spring to come back to life. And so there will be this metering out of little bits of exudates through the winter to the mycorrhizal fungi just to keep them engaged. So having perennials and annuals together is a good way to get diversity in there. Thank you, Sue. Great. Well, again, this will, it is recorded. I hope I did this right. Again, my first time. So if all goes well, I'll send you a link and you can go back over this if you want to learn or review it. And then I'll send you recommendations via email. And if anybody has any other questions, let me know. You're welcome to contact me. You know how to do that. Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. Have a great night. And thank you so much for joining in on this in the group scenario. It's nice to be able to run through several soil tests at once and then kind of cover questions going along. And that way it feels like we've covered more ground. Thank you.